Four friends, Mark, his girlfriend Lisa, their friend David, and his girlfriend Megan, decided to spend the weekend hiking, escaping the noise of the city. Mark, who was passionate about hiking, suggested a route that none of them had ever taken before. It was supposed to be something new, fresh, a real adventure. They set off early in the morning, packing all the necessary things: tents, food, flashlights, and other equipment. The forest they were heading to wasn't very popular among tourists. On the forum, it was mentioned that it was dense, wild, and easy to get lost in. But the friends didn't pay attention to these warnings. Little did they know that this would be their last hike. The road took them deeper into the thicket. The sunlight broke through the dense tree canopies, casting eerie patterns on the ground. Every now and then, they joked, took photos, and enjoyed the silence that was so different from the urban noise. The further they went, the quieter and more desolate the forest seemed. The trees grew thicker, and the trail became less distinct. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Lisa asked, glancing around. "It's so quiet here." "Of course," Mark replied, looking at the map. "We'll walk a bit more and find a good place to camp." By evening, they reached a small clearing, which seemed like the perfect spot for their camp. The friends quickly set up their tents, lit a fire, and began preparing dinner. Everything seemed perfect until Lisa began to feel an inexplicable tension. She couldn't explain what exactly was bothering her, but it felt as though they weren't alone. When the sun dipped below the horizon, Lisa heard a slight rustling in the bushes. She looked around but saw no one. "Mark, did you hear that?" she whispered. "It's just some forest animals," he smiled, trying to calm her down. "Foxes, raccoons, anyone." But Lisa wasn't convinced. Something about the rustling seemed wrong to her. Too rhythmic, too deliberate, like someone was hiding and watching them from the darkness. She asked Mark to check if there was anyone out there. Mark moved away from the camp to inspect the area. He took a few dozen steps toward the trees and felt a shiver run through him. In front of him on the ground were several dozen handprints. Small, large, distorted. Strange, but not impossible. Mark swallowed hard, realizing these couldn't be from the tourists who'd been there before. He didn't see any reason to panic. He returned over the fire, deciding not to mention to his friends what seemed strange. Lisa noticed his uneasy expression. "Did something happen?" she asked. "No, nothing," Mark replied, trying not to show his concern. "Let's just go to bed." But that night, he couldn't sleep for a long time. Thoughts about the prince swirled in his head. When sleep finally overcame him, he still felt like something was wrong, as the prince looked too fresh. The next day started well. They walked, had fun, explored the forest. But when evening came and they decided to head back, they suddenly realized they couldn't find the way back. The trees looked the same, and their tracks were lost in the grass. At first, they joked about it, but gradually each of them began to wear a worried expression. "We came from here, right?" David pointed in one direction. "Think it's from over there," Megan said, pointing in another direction. "Damn it, how did we get lost?" Lisa said nervously. Mark tried to stay calm. "All right, don't panic. Let's pull ourselves together and think logically. The sun sets in the west, so the town should be in that direction." But despite all their efforts, they only ventured deeper into the thicket. The sun gradually sank lower, and the sky turned deep red. A cold breeze passed through the forest, and Lisa felt that same invisible gaze again. "We need to find the way, and fast," she said nervously. But there was no way back. The sun was nearly gone behind the horizon, leaving only a crimson glow on the treetops. The darkness thickened, and with it, a sense of unease grew. Mark squeezed Lisa's hand, trying to calm her, but he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. "We just took the wrong trail," David tried to reassure everyone, though his voice trembled. "We need to keep going." "We've passed this fallen trunk several times," Megan said dryly, pointing to a moss-covered fallen tree. "We're going in circles." Lisa swallowed hard. Something was wrong in this forest. She couldn't explain it, but every step, every sound around them felt wrong, as if the forest wasn't letting them go. "All right," Mark took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Let's stop and try to figure things out. Does anyone have phone service?" Megan took out her smartphone and unlocked the screen. "No signal," she muttered, "and the GPS isn't working." "It's normal, we're in the wilderness," David shrugged. but his confidence was fading. Then we need to find water or at least a path, Lisa said. If we find a river or stream, it'll lead us to people. All right, Mark agreed, but if we don't find the way out in an hour, we'll set up camp and stay here. They moved forward, carefully watching the deepening darkness. The forest became even more unfamiliar. The trees here were taller, their branches intertwined so tightly that almost no light penetrated through the canopy. The air grew heavier, denser, and the sounds of nature seemed muffled. Suddenly, Lisa stopped. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Everyone froze. Somewhere among the trees, a faint rustling was heard, as if something large was moving between the trunks. Lisa's heart raced. It's probably a deer." David tried to smile but nervously swallowed. "Deer don't walk like that," Megan muttered. The rustling repeated, this time closer. Mark squeezed Lisa's hand tighter. "Let's move faster," he ordered. They walked faster, picking up their pace. But the rustling didn't stop. It followed them, moving between the trees, neither getting closer nor falling behind. Suddenly, Mark stopped and stared at the ground. On the soft soil there were prints, but they weren't human footprints from shoes or bare feet. They were handprints, many hands. They stretched along the trail as if something had crawled there on dozens of limbs. "What is this?" Megan gasped, her voice trembling. Mark felt cold panic seize his body. He didn't know what to say. He didn't want to scare his friends, but it seemed like something unnatural was in this forest. "Let's go," he whispered. "Just keep moving." They continued forward, not looking back, but Lisa knew that something was still watching them. Everything was becoming more eerie. The trees seemed taller, their canopies intertwined, forming a dense dome that cut off the last of the light. Mark, Lisa, David, and Megan walked in silence, listening to every sound. It felt as if they were being watched, although none of them dared to say it aloud. "This isn't funny anymore," Megan's voice sounded nervous. "We've seen this rock already." "You're just freaking yourself out," David waved it off, though his voice too carried uncertainty. "Damn, I told you we should have turned by that clearing," Mark snapped irritably. Suddenly, Lisa stopped and stared at something on the ground. Her face went pale. These are handprints," she whispered. "They're everywhere." On the ground stretched human palm prints, as if something or someone had crawled through the dense forest. The prints looked fresh. "Is this some kind of joke?" David laughed nervously. "Who left them?" Suddenly, from behind the trees came a faint, rasping sound, like labored breathing. The friends froze. The air seemed to constrict around their chests, making their hearts race. Megan turned sharply and screamed. On the edge of the clearing, in the darkness between the trees, something stirred. At first, they only saw shadows, but as their eyes adjusted to the dark, the shapes became clearer. A monster, intertwined human bodies formed a single creature, covered in pale, almost gray skin. Dozens of hands reached out, clawing at the ground. Several heads towered above the body, their faces horribly twisted, as if frozen in a silent scream. Fear paralyzed the friends. None of them could move. The creature remained still. It simply stood there, watching. "Run!" Mark was the first to snap out of it, grabbing Lisa's hand. The friends darted into the thicket, not looking back, not thinking about where their feet were taking them. But behind them, they heard a faint, unsettling rustling. The monster was following them. Mark glanced back and saw Lisa. It seemed like they had distanced themselves, but where were David and Megan? "Where are they?" Lisa tried to grab Mark's hand, her voice trembling. I don't know," Mark replied, breathing heavily. "They were right there just a second ago. We can't leave them behind." Lisa frantically looked around in the dark. "What do we do? Go back?" Mark grabbed her shoulders. "If we turn around, we'll be lost too. We need to find a way out." Lisa bit her lip, her eyes filling with tears, but she knew Mark was right. They stood in the middle of the forest, their hearts pounding in their chests. Behind them was the impenetrable darkness they had just fled. "We won't leave them," Mark said softly. "But right now, we need to survive." Lisa nodded, still trembling. They continued moving forward, not knowing what awaited them ahead. Lisa and Mark ran, not looking back. Their hearts beat so loudly it felt like the echo would carry through the entire forest. Behind them, they heard the eerie rustling of countless hands scraping the ground, reaching for them, brushing against tree roots. Mark could feel fear gripping his chest, but right now, the most important thing was to keep running. Suddenly, Lisa tripped and fell. Mark immediately stopped and helped her up. "We can't stop! Get up, Lisa!" He grabbed her hand and pulled her forward. She trembled, her knees scraped, but she forced herself to move on. They sped through the thicket, unaware of the branches scratching their faces and hands. Then they burst into a small clearing, where a far more horrifying scene awaited them. Scattered on the ground were torn clothes, ripped tents, old backpacks, sneakers, one of which was half submerged in mud, a few sleeping bags soaked in something dark. "Oh God," Lisa whispered, covering her mouth with her hand. "This is the creature's territory," Mark rasped. "We've walked straight into its lair." Lisa began to panic, her breathing becoming shallow. "We need to get out of here." Mark took her by the shoulders and looked into her terrified eyes. "Lisa, look at me. We'll get out of here, understand?" She nodded, though her body still trembled. Then once again, they heard the chilling rustling. It grew louder. The leaves rustled as if something huge was crawling between the trees. Somewhere nearby, a crack echoed, like a dry branch snapping. They ran again, but before they had taken even 10 steps, it emerged from the darkness. The monster froze right in front of them, its long, twisted arms outstretched. Its distorted faces moved their lips as if trying to speak, but only a muffled whisper escaped their mouths. The eyes. Those horrible dead eyes stared directly at them. And then Mark noticed something among those faces. David and Megan. "No!" he said in a strained voice. Their faces were twisted, but he couldn't be mistaken. These were his friends. Their eyes, once full of life, were now hollow and endless. Lisa saw it too and froze in terror. This can't be real." Her voice cracked into a whisper. The monster slowly reached toward them. Its numerous hands stretched forward, as if inviting them to become part of this horrifying mass. "Run!" Mark screamed, shoving Lisa forward. But Lisa couldn't move. She stood there staring at the creature. She hoped it was all just a dream, that she'd wake up in her bed. This was just a stupid nightmare. She knelt down and hugged her head with her hands, tears streaming down her face. She heard Mark's bones breaking. She heard his scream, his desperate plea for them to leave him alone, his ragged gasps, and the rustling of the creature drawing closer to her. It was just a dream. This couldn't be happening. But it was.